Generosity Gap, a webinar about generosity and the church. To begin, we're going to go to Brooke Hempell, who's going to share with you some of the findings from our new research. Brooke?
Hello, I'm Brooke Hempell, Senior Vice President of Research at Barna Group. I'd like to share with you some research we recently conducted on generosity and what that looks like for the church and for Christians in America. We conducted a major study over the past year that included qualitative research to dive deeply into perspectives on generosity amongst senior pastors and the general population, 21 pastors and 81 adults in the U.S. Then we used that to create surveys and deeper questionnaires on generosity with senior pastors. 606 senior Protestant pastors completed a survey on their perspectives of generosity in the church, how they teach it, how it's lived out amongst their congregation. And similar questions were asked of 1,556 adults who we qualified as interested Christians. Those would be people who identified with the Christian faith and said that faith is very important or somewhat important in their life, and they've attended church in the past year or more. The first topics we'll look at are what we'll call the mind gap. What do people think about Christian giving? What defines it? You can see here in the green bar that senior pastors define generosity as always a response to Christ's love and an attitude most often. More than half of pastors would select these two definitions of generosity. About a third also characterize generosity as a discipline, sacrificial, or driven by compassion. Similar responses were given by these interested Christians that we interviewed, that generosity is always a response to Christ's love and it's an attitude. But they were also significantly more likely to say that generosity was always driven by compassion or even spur of the moment. We wondered about these more emotional or circumstantial factors, if there was something going on in between generations. And in fact, when you look at this data by the different generations of interested Christians, you see that millennials are significantly more likely to define generosity as spur of the moment. About half of them would qualify it this way, as always or often, spur of the moment. Whereas a very small proportion of elders, boomers, and pastors would say generosity is more circumstantial or spur of the moment. So we see a gap already widening between the generations in what defines generosity. Is it emotional and circumstantial, or is it rational and intentional, or a little bit of both?
Okay, in this first segment, we're talking about the mind gap, the stuff that happens in our brains when it comes to generosity. I'm David Kinnaman, and this is Chris Kopka, and we're going to be talking about just the things that we're learning and the things we've been observing. And really, this is two guys who've been friends for almost a decade, who've been trying to serve the local church in a lot of different ways. Chris has been a great friend and partner when it comes to You Lost Me. Actually, some of his personal story is in the book You Lost Me that I worked on almost a decade ago. And then his organization was a big partner for us when we did the You Lost Me tour. So many of you would have seen Chris either on the You Lost Me tour or at the State of Pastors event. We've also worked on church startups and money, about church planters and their finances. So we've been friends for a long time, and Chris is one of the guys that I turn to for business insight, for advice on how to think about Barna Group and other things that we're working on, as well as being a really good friend. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
So part of our goal as we think about the mind gap is to really talk about some of the things we've learned, some of the ways that this research could affect us as church leaders. What were some of the things that you noticed when you heard Brooke talk about some of the findings?
Yeah, the first one that jumped out to me, and I think it's fascinating, and we saw this visually in her slides, was for elders, it's like 1 in 7 think about generosity as if it's a function of spontaneity. And then for boomers, it's more like, wow, we're looking at like 1 in 4. For our generation, for Gen X, it's 1 in 3. And then for millennials, it's almost 1 in 2. I think that's just fascinating when we think about that probably slow but sure generational change over time. And that doesn't mean all millennials think this way or no elders think that way, but that's a pretty big shift over just a few generations.
Yeah, one of the things I think about as a researcher is that a lot of times this is a perception of how people like to be thought of. So it may represent a real shift in the way that people are thinking about generosity. It may actually also represent a way that they want to be portrayed and they want to present themselves. Either way, it's actually a substantial difference in the way that younger generations are talking about what motivates them and how they get motivated towards generous behavior. And I think that's an interesting opportunity for the church, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and even the way you're describing it, I think for both of us, when we see this kind of data, it also triggers for us individually and on a shared basis, like what's happening in the heart toward the church too. And so as you and I were thinking about this and praying about this coming into this segment, that word that kept coming up for us was adaptability. So what kind of challenge does the church face with this generational shift? And also, what kind of opportunity does it reveal for some churches, hopefully all churches?
Yeah, and so if I'm a pastor who's watching this, I'm thinking about what it means for us as we've sort of wanted to develop, sort of tithing families. Remember, generosity is not just what people give financially, but it's a whole range of things that they do, as we'll discover in this webcast. But when we think about some of the different opportunities that we have as church leaders, there's a different mindset about the predictability of giving, about the predictability of being asked to give. And so I actually think it's a huge opportunity for church leaders to view this spontaneous or more likely to be spontaneous generation with, I think, some sort of fresh eyes.
Yeah, so for pastors, as David and I were prepping to talk about the mind gap, David posed a question to me. The first one was like, okay, what's freaking you out about the data? And then which part is not freaking you out? And so we're going to do a little bit of banter back and forth. So if I was in your shoes, the freak me out part would be with that change from elders to millennials in terms of propensity and how they think about generosity. We can see a thoughtful shift from perhaps more planful giving approaches to more spontaneous giving approaches. On the freak me out part, so many of our churches, almost all of our churches, have individual donations as the primary revenue source, the primary funding source for that church to do that thing that it's doing in the world. And that doesn't mean that we can't have church without financial resources, but it's pretty challenging because there are certain things that when church wishes to do this, it often has some kind of resourcing implication. So that was my big freak me out moment if I were in the shoes of a pastor or a church leader. Like, okay, planful givers are a bit easier to plan around. And so that was my first freak me out. Maybe I'll hand it to you for your freak out.
I would say the biggest area that I'm concerned about stems from a long-standing conversation we've been having, which is that if churches understood that the financial future is directly tied to viewing generosity in a larger way, and the fact that giving is going to be changing, as we're seeing in the mind gap alone, as we'll see in future segments of this webinar, that there are these changes that are happening, and pastors view things very differently than congregants, and generations view things very differently. So that's part of the reason why I get not just freaked out, but I'm actually very hopeful that churches could respond effectively to these changes now that we're going to shine a light on that. But the world is changing, and in terms of the way people think and act generously, I think that's also going to affect the way local churches work.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly, or not exactly, but that's one of the things that brought hope to, the flip side of the freak out is, here's this very hopeful thing that's happening slowly but surely and changes over time. And so on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with being thoughtful. That's a good thing. But there's also nothing wrong with being spontaneous if you think about it in a slightly different way. I believe, and you believe, that we're seeing a change in how generations are thinking about generosity. And so what's the good news behind that? The good news behind it is millennials are probably less likely to overthink whether or not this is a moment that they're invited into to be generous in some way. And so that downside risk of moving away from some planfulness also creates that upside opportunity for more spontaneous positive action. And so helping the church, helping church leaders think through that and look at adaptive responses to it is a big part of our heart for this work.
Yeah, and I think some of the things we've been learning about millennials in general is that they're more willing to be challenged than the church is willing to be challenged. And it's one of the large themes, findings that we've been coming to for years about millennials. So when you apply that to generosity and you think about the fact that they're more likely to say they respond to spontaneous appeals, not just financially, by the way, but across a range of different things, maybe local churches should be thinking about ways that they present different opportunities to be generous. And they're not just, maybe in like the sort of one note or a monochromatic sort of definition of here's the same thing we're always asking you week after week, just to put money into the plate, to be generous. There's different ways to think about sort of striking this spontaneous chord with millennials. And frankly, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just young people who are expressing that. You've got Gen Xers, you've got a lot of boomers who are saying that, you've got a lot of elders. And a lot of the research behind generosity today is showing that people are driven, or at least affected by their emotions in a way they can't even always articulate. Yeah, exactly.
And occasionally in this moment, we're not able to fully articulate it either. So hopefully you'll find a bit of humor in that. So two other things that David was hitting on that I think makes sense to lift up too, that if we were in your shoes, one, I think back to You Lost Me. And one of the powerful things for me in reading You Lost Me, and I suspect it was true for a lot of pastors too and lay leaders, is on the one hand, you're trying to help churches kind of unpack and understand a generation. On the other hand, you didn't assume that the generation behaved exactly this way every time for all things. And so that's a really important implication in the generosity gap research, that we're going to show propensities in this instance, we're talking about a propensity towards spontaneity for millennials. That's not true of all millennials. It's true for, looks like about 1 and 2, but it's also true for a bunch of Xers and boomers and even some elders. And so we urge you to kind of, on the one hand, draw a lot of insights out from the research, and on the other hand, not to, in a way, not to stereotype. And then this is implicit in what you're saying, David, too, but you've thought a lot about, and there are some other folks who've thought a lot about too, that even as we see generational shifts, that doesn't necessarily mean you or Barna or Thrivent or anybody else is suggesting that, like, okay, and now you have to change your theology. And so this is something that I've learned a lot from you, and I've learned from Tim Schuster and others on like the distinction between theology and methodology, and I was wondering if you'd unpack that a bit.
Yeah, I think the whole theme for this webinar is that the world is changing. So the generosity gap is here. We're going to talk about, we've been seeing some of the gaps between pastors and lay people, between generations. And in order to adapt to this new reality, we're not asking for people to think new thoughts theologically. We are thinking about new approaches methodologically. And so that's really one of the key themes that comes out of this work, is to reinvent, to adapt methodologically as we think about generosity. This has been the first segment of the Mind Gap, focusing in on how we think about generosity. And in the next segment, we're going to be talking about the Heart Gap, how people perceive and feel and sort of how they live generously. A lot of differences in terms of generations. Again, the invitation for this whole segment, as well as the generosity gap in total, is for you to go through a lot of the findings in the monograph, the generosity gap. We designed this to be kind of a conversational setting to bring insights to you as church leaders. We also invite you to dive deep into the findings that come in that report, because you can, I think, sort of measure where you are as a local church against some of those things that we're seeing in the research. So for Chris, I'm David, and thanks for joining us for the first segment of the Generosity Gap.